Can you hear me well?
Yep. Oh, yes.
Oh wait, is it playing through the? No. Do you feel you're much louder than I am, or do you feel that's
I don't.
well balanced?
It's hard for me to hear. It seems the same.
Yeah.
I
Okay,
actually,
me too.
I think you're even a little.
Yeah, I think you
maybe
could
a
move that
little-
a little closer to you, even. No,
I could.
like that. Let's hear that.
Yeah, but I don't want to be not
Stuck
able to
in there.
move my body.
Okay, how's that? Yeah. No.
Okay. Yeah.
No. Miserable.
No, not miserable.
Happy?
I need to be able to.
These are the opening kind of scenes of my life dream, which is I kept secret for a long time, which was to be a talk show host. And the podcast form has become the entry point into that.
Uh-huh.
And so today we are here with one of my favorite people in the whole world, and one of my oldest friends, and my former sister-in-law, Chloe Cockburn. And wow, we can talk about so many things because you're so endlessly interesting and full of interests. When I met you in 2002, nearly 20 years ago, you were a painter. You just graduated from Harvard, moved to San Francisco, and decided to pursue a kind of bohemian creative life. And then, well, actually talk about that a little bit. What at the time were you planning on being a painter? Was that your life?
I didn't really know. I graduated in 2001 and moved into this amazing space in San Francisco in Soma. We made it into a 10-person warehouse space. We built all our rooms. They were dear friends from college and all doing interesting things. And we weren't a house of artists, but everyone had some artistic bent. But it was the first time I had sort of been outside of intense academics. And so I was just kind of decompressing from all of that. I was painting houses for Daddy's Girl Painting Company.
Is that what the name was that your company, or you worked for them?
These two gay women had the company. We mostly painted gay men's interiors. Oh, wow. Which was really fun because you get to go in the house and see their incredible, precise style. And then I was writing application essays or editing application essays for people applying to business school. That was my other gig. And
then you were also painting abstract kind of high art, not painting. Not when I said you were a painter, I didn't mean you were just painting houses.
Not just a house painter. Yes.
But that seems like in a way the farthest you can go from academic. I mean, obviously there's academic painting, but there seems to be a different part of the brain being used when you're doing that sort of work versus doing very cerebral.
I mean, you could think about left brain, right brain. I mean, I think more quote unquote right brain activities of painting still require the analytic capacity to make certain decisions, what's in, what's out, and composition. There's a intuitive feel for space, and there's also a sort of theory about how the person's eye will perceive it and structure. So you keep that analytic side, and then on the flip side with primarily analytical work, where you're breaking things down logically and lining them up linearly and sort of like proceeding A, B, C, D, of course, the analysis is much richer and improved, I'd say, when you bring that more intuitive or holistic sense, or a sense of all-overness. You know, when you look at a painting, as I'm sure you know, when they're at the early 20th century, they're thinking about like what are the essential qualities of different forms of art. And music, of course, requires the time dimension. You start here and proceed through. Whereas a painting, you can take it all in one instant, but then you take it in more and more over time. But you're sort of taking in different aspects. Your eye might follow a line or a road or something if it's a representational painting, but you're also sort of feeling the whole thing at the same time. And that quality of perception is really helpful when you're working on analytical problems also.
Interesting. And then I still quote you to this day. I don't know if this was your own original conjecture or you were quoting someone else, but that the difference between New York, where you had very ambitious. Do you remember this? Because in San Francisco now it's changed with all tech, but San Francisco, when it was such a bohemian place 20 years ago, you started to feel that there was just a lot of very smart people, but with very little ambition. And you said New York is great because it's very smart people with a lot of ambition. And then LA, forget it, because it's a lot of dumb people with a lot of ambition.
I know, that's not my quote, and I would never say that about LA. I love LA.
You did say this. Now you're backtracking.
I would never like instigate a quote with judging LA in that way.
Oh, okay. But so you, after living, how long did you live this communal painter life?
I suppose, I'm just trying to think back. Not too long, perhaps not even 2 years. And then I not woke up. Well, I had an experience one day that made me realize that I didn't want to live on the island of the Lotus Eaters forever. That I needed to go somewhere and actually sort of engage with life in a different way. Because at the time in San Francisco, I felt like I was sort of an unpaid therapist to dozens of friends, and we were all just in this play space, but it didn't feel particularly meaningful. There was no politics to it. And so I said I wanted to move to New York, and then it all came together really quickly. I moved to New York and went from being intensely social and around all these people in the San Francisco scene to being intensely solitary in New York, and kind of cleared out my mind and reset. Though I still came back to California all the time.
Mind you, Chloe comes from a family of overachievers in some sense. Like, I mean, the opposite of my family, where I joke that we've gone hundreds of years without doing anything useful for society. And whereas, Chloe's, do you want to talk a little bit about your background, your parents, how they helped shape you and what they do, how they've engaged politically in the world?
I mean, they've written a lot of books, so if anyone's interested, they can read their books. My mom wrote a book called Looking for Trouble, 1 Woman, 6 Wars and a Revolution. My dad, unfortunately, hasn't written a memoir, but they've written a lot of interesting books. And my favorite book by him is Kill Chain. And the subtitle is Drones and the Rise of High-Tech Assassins. Really good book. As I've given away, they are writers, they're journalists. And my uncles are writers. My uncle Alexander Cockburn is dead, but he was a writer, of course. My cousins, my grandparents, it's very much in the family. Scribble, as Alexander once self-deprecatingly said. Right, and not fiction writers. I mean, all journalistic sort of description or essayists. My grandfather was a communist.
Claude Cockburn, who, if you don't know, is one of the greatest journalists and writers of the 20th century.
Who unfortunately died when I was 2. So we knew each other, but only in that sense that a very young child and an elderly person have a nonverbal, powerful spiritual communication. So I was born in London, and my father's Irish, my mother's from California, and we settled in the East Coast, which I like to think of as, we have no roots in the East Coast, but it was a good distance away from Ireland and California. So my sister and brother and I grew up in New York and then DC. So they, as journalists, they're involved in, very aware of and engaged with domestic politics, international politics, the various forays of the American military or secret U.S. funding to support, vicious, violent groups in various countries that murdered a lot of people. So that's what I grew up with, whether it was Iran-Contra or the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia or the Iraq War. That was all very much part of my awareness growing up.
And they weren't just writing; they were doing documentaries
Yes.
for Frontline. They were doing 60 Minutes,
Yes.
right? This really crossing media in an attempt to, what would you say, if just bring awareness and affect change? Like, did you grow up with a sense that like each human had a responsibility to kind of leave the world a better place, or to just be active in a radical? I mean, I've interviewed both your uncles, Patrick Cockburn and Alexander, for a series we were doing for Counterpunch, which was your late uncle's great political website. And I remember Patrick saying that the seeds of radicalism were kind of sowed early, but kept continuing to grow throughout his life. And he defined radicalism as like a deep mistrust of people in power, and as a kind of sense that people will do as little good as they have to and as much harm as they can when they have power. But it's interesting because there are also people who have been very like on the inside, right, in terms of connectedness and of access to power and to people with power. I mean, I remember going to a party with some family members of yours, and there was like Paul Wolfowitz and Henry Kissinger and like all these people. And I'm curious about, do you think about this kind of rebellion from the inside, in a sense, that happens from people who grow up with a certain access and a certain privilege and still work to kind of challenge it and I wouldn't say undermine, but maybe improve.
Yeah, there's
or call out.
There's a lot there in what you just said. First of all, I think it's important not to be cynical about the possibility of wielding power in a way that's good for people, because if you hold the view that anyone holding power is to be mistrusted, then you're not going to be able to govern.
Right.
So you're just permanently locking yourself on the outside as the critic, which is an important and helpful role for some to play. But if everyone's a critic who also wants to manifest a new world, I mean, what are your options? You can build small utopias and hope they don't get crushed, or critique the dominant power but have no hope for change. I think it's important to believe in the possibility of partnership with the inside game and sort of revolutionary potential on the inside. But I think the key there perhaps is who is one really loyal to in terms of, in this sort of tribal sense. I mean, maybe not quite tribal, but it's like what often happens when one goes into the inside game, particularly if one hasn't grown up in it. If you're sort of admitted to the halls of power in some way, you immediately start adapting and taking on that culture and, quote, forgetting where you're from. And this is the fear and the danger. If someone goes in, they're going to forget where they're from, start acting like those people that hold all the power, and then, rule in a way that's harmful. So it seems like the problem there is the broken connection between that person and this other community on the outside. And so you need quite powerful cultural bonds, and including movement culture, that really continue to reinforce and connect the person back, so that they are, even though they're on the inside, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example. She's inside Congress. She's, by all, I don't know her personally, but she seems to be very rooted in and connected with outside communities and really aligned with that, rather than being entranced in some way by being able to go to this or that event, or seated next to such and such person, or feel valuable because they, have a certain title or something like that.
And so back to the chronology here, that, in typical Chloe powerhouse fashion, you said, I remember you kind of implied that you weren't feeling quite challenged enough, and that you might think about going to law school. And
well, I moved to New York to paint and to be a solitary cat and kind of figure out what I was about. And I like to think, New York either embraces you or spits you out. I was in a liminal phase for a little while. I had enough New York in me not to get spit out. I wasn't yet embraced. I hadn't figured out how I wanted to fit, but it was a good space for me to be in. And then I kind of became, I went to the gallery shows and had a look at the New York art world, and fair play to anyone who can make art in that environment. But I wasn't really interested in trying to enter that social club of gallerists, in part because I'm not particularly interested in advocating on behalf of myself. You like the work or you don't,
right.
Which is a terrible strategy. If you want to sell your paintings, you have to be kind of on fire for what you're making and a true advocate for it. But I felt like I was much more interested in being an advocate for something outside of me. Not to say that's more valuable. It was just my orientation. And one day, got the suggestion from a little bird that considered law school. And I thought, yeah, actually I could go and take on the Patriot Act. That would be a really cool thing to do. So I applied that day. No, I didn't apply that day. I did all the things you have to do, transcripts and sign up for the LSAT, things like that.
Did you apply to several?
Yeah, 4 schools.
And did you get into all of them?
No.
No?
No.
But you got into the best one?
Well, I think so. Yeah, I went to Harvard Law School. And then as soon as I got there, I think it's a really interesting place in part because it's bigger than most law schools. So you have more of whatever different types of things. You have more corporate types. You also have more lefty types. You have more of every kind of different segment of the student community. And so you could actually form community with each other.
Okay, so you weren't I imagined you would be in a very distinct minority being a lefty.
No, there was a bunch. There was a whole magazine and everything.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And did you already then have a plan for what you wanted to get out of law school and what you wanted to do with it? Or did that kind of unfold slowly?
Well, I was immediately captivated by criminal law, which is what I do now.
Mm-hmm.
And I have since, that was in 2004. So 18 years I've been focused on this one super rich, important, deep topic. I had Alan Dershowitz for my 1L law course.
Who had the kind of very public disagreements with your uncle, no?
Yes, he did. And so he tried to balance that by being especially nice to me.
Oh.
It was funny. But he would put me on the spot in criminal law. So in law school, they will call on you and set you up in hypothetical situations in front of 100 other students, try to catch you out. It's a really oppressive environment. But he would constantly make me Judge Cockburn and try to get me to sign a hypothetical torture warrant. We know the bomb's on the plane and this guy's done it. Do you pull out his fingernails? And I would say, no, torture.
And he seems to have gone slowly more and more to the right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, what is right and left and what does all that mean in this context is interesting.
It's changing a lot.
I don't think his fundamental nature has changed. I think things around him have shifted so that he shows up in a different way. Interesting.
I'd love to dig a little deeper into that at some point, but let's make sure we hit the essentials. So, would you say he was a positive influence on you, even if it was in reaction to him?
Yeah, I thought he was a good teacher. Most law school professors put a lot of energy into making very clear to everyone that they're the smartest person in the room. Mm-hmm. And Professor Dershowitz was so fully convinced of his intellectual superiority that he didn't feel like he had to perform it. And so he opened a lot of room for us to argue and engage and even make a point against him because it was just no contest.
Right.
So it was actually a more open and lively space than many other classes.
Interesting.
Strangely enough.
And he was nice to you, so that's good. And so you graduate from law school, and I think the first job you got was for the ACLU, right?
No, the first job was with the Vera Institute.
Oh, remind me, what was that?
I had a fellowship. Vera is like a policy. Well, it's existed in New York for many years, and they are known in part for doing kind of experimental projects, trying it out and demonstrating it, and then maybe government picks it up. Often in the realm of majority in the realm of criminal justice work, and then they support states on policy. And they recently worked very hard on restoring Pell Grants to people in prison, for example, to make sure they could access education. But the project that I got into pretty early on when I got there was in New Orleans, which was pretty special. So Katrina had happened not too long previously. I can't remember exactly how long before. I mean, I was there in 2007. I guess Katrina was in 2005. This is embarrassing.
Yeah. Correct.
So they were still reeling.
Mm-hmm.
And Vera had written this lengthy memo with a report with a set of recommendations for what they should do for their justice system, because part of the opportunity when things are smashed up, physically or in terms of the bureaucracy, is that you can enact changes that would never have been possible otherwise, because it's just all a mess anyway. It has to be put back together. Why not do it a different way? So Vera had given these recommendations, and the city council, there was a champion whose name escapes me, but who was said, got them all to say, yes, we'll do all of it. Come down and do it. And Vera was like, oh, okay. We didn't expect you to right away tell us to come down and do all this stuff. So I joined the team that was working on that. And I spent a month there for 9 months, working as a fresh out of law school person who, what do I know? But I was, my job was to try to research and help them accept and develop a plan for implementing a community service sentencing alternative. So when someone would be arrested of an offense and charged, instead of them going to jail or prison, to say, no, this person should have a consequence, but community service would be adequate, and let's do that. And they didn't have one. I mean, it's very common elsewhere around the country, but they didn't have one in New Orleans. It was a total failure.
Why? I'm just realizing that the front of the mic is...
Oh, because I'm turning towards you.
Exactly.
Okay.
Let's try this.
Got a mic adjustment.
That's better. Thank you.
So why was it a failure? Well, there were different people on the team working on different interventions. And so my colleague John Wool's work was a success, just to be clear. It wasn't like the whole project was a failure. My piece was a failure in that, well, I'll just tell the story. So I researched the community service sentencing alternative. I convened a table. I don't know how old I was, 27 or something. And convening this table of judges, district attorneys, the coroner's office, other sort of important inside system actors, talking about this thing that was this foreign concept to them, but very common elsewhere in the country, and they sort of getting bought in and okay in concept. But sort of towards the end, when I thought, okay, we've got buy-in conceptually, now I have to figure out, let's look at some real cases of who actually could we imagine could have this sentence, hypothetically, like real people that aren't going to receive it, but would be an example. So I go to the DA's office and go through boxes and boxes of rap sheets, which is really a chore to look through because they're kind of weirdly formatted and hard to understand. So I'm hours and hours and hours paging through these rap sheets and finding people where I thought, based on their history, maybe this person, not knowing anything about them personally, but just based on their rap sheet, could they work? And I put together a list of 14. I had their name and I had their charge, the present charge, and then past arrests, past convictions, and so on. And was basically optimizing for people not having serious convictions, only misdemeanors or something like that. So I bring it in to meet with the DA. It's the big moment. We're like, okay, this could be great. And she looks at it and she says, oh no, we couldn't do community service sentencing for any of these people. And I said, why? She said, well, look at all these arrests, for all these serious things. I said, oh, but those are arrests. They weren't convictions. She said, oh, we treat arrests like convictions here.
Oh my God.
And in my mind, my head, it just hit the table.
Yeah, it's hitting my head, but it's hitting the table right now.
I was like, what the hell? And it was a good lesson, particularly for working in Louisiana, New Orleans, is that you think you understand what's going on and you don't. You just don't. It's a place that sort of defies a direct, clear, point by point approach. And that was a really extreme example. I'd never thought to ask the question, do you treat arrests like convictions? Because who would do that?
Right.
No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. So that didn't work. But like I said, John's work worked. And I'll tell you, though, and a really important figure that I met during that time, who I've since worked with closely, is Norris Henderson. Runs an organization called, the acronym is VOTE, V-O-T-E. And they have different names that map to the acronym. Voice of the Experienced and Voters Organized to Educate, the different sort of sides of this organization. But Norris had been wrongfully incarcerated in Angola, which is a plantation prison. I mean, it is a plantation. They're out picking cotton, with men on horseback with guns. That's what we're looking at. He was there for 27 years. And while inside became, as a lot of people do, a jailhouse lawyer, helped people get out. And I believe, I don't actually know the particular history of his case did he get himself out, or he partnered? He must have had, I think he had some outside legal support. So Norris formed this organization. I met him one day when I was down at City Hall, and he had brought numerous members from the community to speak on a particular law that was being discussed. And I saw him and I'm like, that's the guy I need to work with, because he's plugged in and organized with community. It's clear that he's a leader. I'm just talking to these judges and coroners people. They have no reason to care really about what I say. And this was my first inklings of the sort of notion of leverage, which is very important in making any type of social change. You don't persuade people just based on, they like you and it's a good idea. You have to have some leverage to push for something. Because usually, if you're doing something meaningful, it's significantly different from how it is already, which is going to disrupt things and piss off certain constituencies. And so what have you got? It's got to be more than your bright and charming self. You have to be able to bring some kind of political consequence to someone if you're going to try to push them to do something. Make it worth their while. And also ensure that it's not going to, totally destroy their political prospects. So I clocked Norris and I was like, okay, I got to work with this guy. But then for various reasons, we were not able to work together. I had to continue with my inside meetings with people, and then fast forward, it just didn't work. The DA said, we treat arrests like convictions, which meant basically there were no eligible cases. And I thought in that moment, if I had been allowed to work with Norris, we could have a rally on the steps tomorrow, like to bring attention to this and start to put some kind of pressure and to reveal the ridiculousness of this. But we didn't have that partnership. So, but then fast forward several years and several jobs later, I litigated. I worked for the ACLU Racial Justice Project, then the campaign to end mass incarceration. And then in 2015, I came to my present job, which is working at Open Philanthropy, where I direct their criminal justice reform program and give them recommendations on where to put money. And I also work with donors, other donors, to the extent that they're interested in doing criminal justice reform work, specifically to have fewer people in jail and prison, which I think more and more people understand now. We have an absolutely ridiculous number and proportion of our population in jail and prison. It's just far outstrips the rest of the world, including Russia and China. There's no comparison.
Wow.
It's absolutely insane. It's so intense. It's so destructive. Generations of communities destroyed. It's torturous inside. Families broken apart. Once you start looking at it, you're like, I can't do anything else.
And so
than
often
this.
for nonviolent offenses.
Well, we can talk about violence and nonviolence in a bit, because that's a sort of actually a rich topic. But a lot of people get drawn in through all these ways that you might think is sort of ridiculous. Often people's first arrest might be for something like marijuana. People in prison are not there for marijuana unless it's massive dealing.
Yeah.
But their first arrest, which then leads to, then they're in the system. Then if they're picked up again, now they're going to get charged. It sort of snowballs over time. And it starts young in terms of who's targeted and who's picking up these arrests.
But wait, you skipped a big chapter, and I want to...
No,
okay,
but the reason I led into all that is connecting with Norris is that when I came to this position, I knew that what we were missing in this mass incarceration work as a field, we had smart inside game policy people with a lot of good ideas to fix things, but we had no leverage. There was no organized base on the outside saying, we want this. In fact, what you had for decades were voters rewarding electeds for being particularly vicious. Mm-hmm. You could say you could run a campaign based on how many people you'd sent to the death chamber, and people would say that's fantastic, back to office. Of course, many people disagree, but they were not organized. And so a huge focus of the funding recommendations I've done have been around investing in people like Norris, and we have put a good amount of money towards his work and others like that, directly impacted people, formerly incarcerated people, or people from communities who want to see a different vision of safety and don't see prison and jail as serving them well or serving safety, but need to develop a political force in order to make that point and succeed.
I want to go way deeper into this, but I still want to go back to this kind of structure of the narrative of your life and how you came to this place of what, both philosophically and practically, to do what you're doing now. So after this work in New Orleans, that's when you started working for the ACLU? It was about a year later?
Yeah, the next job, I worked for a federal judge as a clerk, and then I went to the ACLU Racial Justice Project.
How was it working for the federal judge? What did that teach you?
Taught me how to write.
Uh-huh.
My judge was Judge Sifton, who's since passed away, who was a Carter appointee, a former prosecutor.
What circuit?
Eastern District of New York,
uh-huh.
which is in the Second Circuit.
Okay.
But I was a district judge, so it's a trial level judge. And a clerk works on all types of cases. I was interested in criminal law, but most of our work was about, commercial litigation, and including one particularly wild case around a cat circus suing another cat circus for IP infringement.
I didn't know there was such a thing as a cat circus. What's a cat circus?
Also didn't know there was such a thing. It's a whole bunch of cats doing circus tricks, which is just a marvel, because you have a cat, you know that it's not really what they're interested in doing. But yeah, there are cat circuses, and there were two of them in this big fight. And so we couldn't help but put some puns in the opinion because it was just too ridiculous.
Do you remember any of them? I'm a pun fanatic, so.
I know you are. I wish I could. But my judge was a pretty serious, like straight and narrow kind of judge. But even he had to give in and put a couple quips in there. But how was it? So he taught me to write. So I remember, we would read all the papers and draft the first draft of these opinions. And I remember him saying to me once, make it more logical. And I was like, okay, yes, Judge, I will do that. I didn't really understand what that meant. But then another time, this was the one that really brought it home for me. He said, you're not writing a novel. And what I took from that is, this isn't some narrative exposition where in the end you kind of discover the truth. The legal writing is you punch someone in the face, and then you tell them why you had to do it, why it was a good idea, and then you punch them again. And that is like how you communicate. It's very direct. In part because you don't want someone to be at all confused about the point you're making. And when writing for a judge, it has to be powerful, authoritative, persuasive.
Does the judge do any of the writing himself, or he just tells you what to write and you go do it?
My judge did not do the writing. We did the writing.
When they're young, do they write and then they start passing it on? Or?
They're all different.
I see.
They're all different. Some judges will do the first draft of opinions, and they're all completely different. They're all little, sitting in their own kingdoms. Yeah. Running things how they want to run them.
So interesting. Okay, so how long did you do the clerking?
That was 1 year. That's just.
And is that something that's often a kind of gateway type of job or do people clerk forever?
No, it's just a 1 or 2 year job. You might get a second clerkship, but the point is that judges need assistance managing the caseload and doing the writing, and then it's very good experience for the recent law grad because you're doing the most powerful training for persuasive writing, which is taking the other side. So mostly litigators are trying to persuade the judge of something. So working for a judge and seeing what it looks like when someone makes this argument or that argument, and you're like, oh, this is ridiculous. I can't believe they did that. Those are really useful lessons for when you're on the other side and trying to persuade the judge or the clerk by extension to do something.
And at this point, once you'd seen what you'd seen between law school and your first job and now clerking, as you saw the kind of inner workings of the, our system of justice and court, and did it make you more or less cynical about the possibility of, true justice? Or at least, obviously, we have ideals like democracy. And then, if you work in politics, you might say, well, no, it's all, or, I remember when your mother was running for Congress, I would thought, wow, this is cool. Like I'm getting, even though I wasn't living with you guys anymore or as close to you, but I saw like what it took to actually, you have to go and convince a bunch of people to vote for you. And I thought that was kind of refreshing, right? To see that, that there is a real basic way things work that does seem to stick somewhat with all sorts of, mitigating factors, but there is a kind of essential truth to the process. And I'm wondering if at this point, having seen what you'd seen by then, did it make you think like, okay, this is, it needs to have the kinks worked out, but it is a forum in which the truth can be discovered and justice can be meted out, or is it rotten to the core?
I wouldn't take either of those views, that that's pure and true with a few flaws, or that it's rotten. First of all, and you mentioned process, I think it's important to think about which type of justice you're talking about. We could talk about procedural justice. That is to say, it was a fair process versus, I don't know what the term actually be, but there was a just outcome. You could have a just outcome through a weird process. You could have a fair process and an unjust outcome.
I mean, from what I've heard, like my brother, who's been involved in the criminal justice system as a victim of it in many ways, and in some ways as, reap the reward of being a white man. I remember he got arrested at the same time as a black friend of mine's little brother, who were the same age, getting into similar sorts of trouble. But my brother had way worse accusations of drugs and weapons and false identity, and he went in front of the judge and they gave him 6 months. And then my other dear friend's little brother stole a VCR and got locked up for 2 years.
Yep.
And it was happening at the same time. So there was such a terrible, kind of confrontation with how unjust that aspect of the system is. And then I remember my brother telling me, well, nobody's going to trial. If they were, the whole system would collapse, because 99% of cases are having to be, plea bargained, because, they'll offer you a deal that you can't say no to, because you're going to risk, no matter how right you think you are, you're going to risk getting locked up for life when you could just go away for a couple of years, no matter how convinced you are of your own innocence. So that's what I mean, as far as seeing kind of systemic issues that seem almost insurmountable when you start getting into the innards of it, like a sausage factory where you don't want to see how the sausage is made.
Well, I was aware of that before clerking, because I worked for defenders in law school.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really clear when you see a courtroom that, particularly young black men are grist for the mill.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking through why that is and how it came to be and how to change it has been my work for the past 18 years. It's a really rich and deep topic that bears continued reading and reflection. And there's been such an amazing proliferation of thoughtful writing and powerful campaigning work on exactly these types of questions in the past couple of years. Of course, Black Lives Matter and Ferguson, and then also the leadership of whether we're talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates or Sherilyn Ifill, or any number of one of these amazing thinkers and activists, really drilling into that and bringing more and more people to awareness about the fact that this supposedly neutral process is at every stage absolutely deeply biased and selecting over and over again for the sort of most punitive outcome for Black people, or also poor people or people who are less empowered, and the least punitive outcome for the people from the powerful class, because prison isn't for them. What is prison really for then? We have a social story around it's keeping us safe, or enacting a fair consequence, a punishment for someone committing a harm. But when you see how it plays out, you can't maintain that view when you see how it plays out. In part, but given the contrasts that you mentioned, those contrasts play out over the whole system. I'll give one, the great Brian Stevenson, who I hope everyone knows of. And if you don't know about him, you should look him up, read his book, Just Mercy, or see his TED Talk or any one of his talks. Brian Stevenson remarks about so he's an amazing litigator, defense attorney, death penalty worker in Alabama. And he talks about going to Germany and talking to them, asking them about the death penalty. Do you have it? And they said, oh God, no, of course not. He said, why not? He said, well, we as Germans, we can't have the death penalty. It's not about who, quote, deserves to die. It's about who deserves to kill. Right. And we as Germans can't do that. We just cannot. And then by extension also, Brian says, imagine if you went to a courtroom in Germany and every single defendant was Jewish.
Wow. Yeah.
And yes, this one committed a robbery and this one was running drugs. And you'd be like, yes, but
I got chills. Yeah.
If everyone is Jewish, I'm just going to suggest that maybe you have a different kind of problem going on here.
That is one of the most just devastating framings I've ever heard. You gave me chills there. Wow. Yeah, in Italy, I remember the Italian Constitution, as read by Roberto Benigni, the great comic and social commentator and filmmaker. He did this show where he just like read the Italian Constitution out loud for an hour and a half. And the part where this like the death penalty is constitutionally illegal, and he said it's because I don't want to be even 1/50 millionth of a killer. Mm-hmm. Like I it's just not. We don't want to be in that business, mm-hmm. right? And I think that Americans don't have that framing around the issue. They're always, more about whether it's right to do it to the person or right for the families of the victims and stuff like that.
Well, we haven't grappled with our history.
Correct. Yeah.
I mean, there's little bouts of grappling, but it's not a true grappling, not a true acknowledgement. I mean, look at the 1619 Project with the New York Times. You have it's like a right-wing talking point to smash and trash it and sort of challenge its basic presumptions, because they see an examination of American history, which includes genocide and slavery, amongst other horrors, as a disparagement of America in that sense of the ideal, the spirit of the nation. But recognizing and acknowledging wrongdoing is not to say that something is evil, but it would be evil to not recognize it and then to continue to perpetuate those harms. So there's a real resistance to examining history, perhaps, as other people have said, of course, before me. The guilty conscience is really one that says, I know I did something really awful, and if I admit it, well, the only right thing would be sort of for that to happen to me in turn. I am part of a lineage that, held slaves, and if I really admit that, well, then am I going to be subjected to that? Because it kind of projects upon the other side this set of assumptions about how you treat other people. It's a real tell.
I want to take a slight philosophical detour, because also our friend Aaron, who's joining us, and we are all constantly arguing about this. You worked for the ACLU, and there is a narrative that I've been kind of exposed to, and I don't know if it's just kind of a right-wing, propaganda that I've been a victim of, or if it's true. But there's been this idea that I've been kind of cringing about a little bit, which is that the left used to stand very strongly for, certain principles like free speech and especially if you don't agree with it, because everybody likes free speech they agree with, right? And the ACLU that you worked for, famously in the 1960s, I think it was, defended the rights of this Nazi group to march, right? Exactly. And they, there was this idea that I no matter how horrible what you stand for is, I still believe more than anything in your right to express that viewpoint, right? And there seems to be a narrative going on that, I've seen little tastes of here and there, that the left has moved away from that ideal and towards a slightly more restrictive view of what free speech is, and maybe free speech isn't so free after all, and maybe we shouldn't be giving platforms to people whose views we find hideous, and then the right is using this as a way to kind of discredit or call out a hypocrisy, and I worry that I think I sympathize with that more old-fashioned, or maybe it's not old-fashioned, I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, view that we need to defend even the rights of the most heinous speech and engage with ideas. The best way to fight bad ideas with good ideas, not with silencing.
A couple of things I want to lay clear. So the First Amendment is about government not infringing your right to speak. So whether Twitter platforms someone is not a First Amendment question.
Right.
You could say there's a First Amendment principle.
Right.
So then I think it's really a question of trade-offs of...
And there's the way that these social media have become kind of public utilities in a way. But anyway, we don't need to get into that.
I mean, we're in the middle of that evolution. But we make choices about what to put our energy towards and really being concerned about and investing in. And are we really going to think the most hard about ensuring that, white Nazi guy can say what he wants? Or what about, there's a lot of other people whose ability to command an audience has sort of been structurally limited, whether we're talking about any kind of sort of many marginalized groups, LGBTQI or Black women or Native women or Latinx women or men as well. I mean, all sorts of people are trying to would like to access the public channel and communicate with other people. So are we going to really put our energy into ensuring that there's an amplification of these voices that have been sort of institutionally, structurally suppressed? Or are we going to be really intently concerned to make sure that the white Nazi gets to speak? And I think it's always a question of resources. It's fine to have opinions and, some kind of ideas about how stuff should work. But when you think about in the next period of time, what am I really going to focus on making happen? Where am I really going to put my energies in terms of ensuring that this or that person gets to speak? And I think it's legit to make, you have to make choices. And I think it's it's a trap, this conversation, because it's about, suggesting people aren't being true to their ideals, but it's taking it out of the practice of day to day. Let's focus more on platforming certain people rather than wringing our hands around the deplatforming of others. Except also a lot of that challenge is brought towards things that aren't really deplatforming. It's more like people bringing a critique to someone and saying this person is saying awful things.
Right.
I mean, isn't that the discourse that we're talking about? I think there's this sort of the veneer of my free speech is being challenged because I'm being disagreed with.
Right. So do you think that the whole concept of cancel culture is just a right-wing construct, or do you think that there is some issue there that's
I mean, I think other people have spoken at length about this with a deeper and richer perspective, and so I don't really want to go into that. I think it's just it's not a authentic conversation about that.
Interesting.
It's about drawing people out and pinning them down in order to gotcha. I don't receive that discussion around cancel culture as being any kind of authentic searching for balance and truth by any means.
Okay, good. I like that. And then so just again to go back to how you got to where you are doing what you're doing now. What did you do for the ACLU, and what did you learn from that experience?
Oh my God, are we going to go through every year of my life?
Not every year, just every job. That's this last one before this one, right?
Okay. Well, the first time I worked for the ACLU, I was a litigation fellow in their racial justice project.
I'm liking learning all this.
My boss was Vanita Gupta, who then I worked for again, and I'll tell you in a minute, and now has just been confirmed as number 3 at the Department of Justice, which is great. Uh-huh. She's amazing. Excuse me. And I did some criminal justice work and some education access work. And then I worked for a civil rights law firm called Neufeld, Scheck and Brustin, doing police misconduct, civil rights litigation. So someone had been wrongfully incarcerated because the police had coerced a confession, and years later they're proven innocent, and then you can go back and sue that police department. So I did that for 2 years, and then came back to the ACLU to the campaign to End Mass Incarceration, where at that time I was then doing advocacy and policy, helping ACLU affiliates around the country kind of wrap their head around the laws that were coming up, bills in state legislatures. Do we try to stop this, or can we get this bill passed, et cetera? And
then, okay, so we can cut to the chase, because I know that you're most interested in what you're doing.
And what I'm doing now. But I will say something else. To add to the Norris point I made earlier, something I experienced really strongly at the ACLU doing that policy work was how we had no leverage. So when you're litigating, you have the leverage of the law in the court. So even one person could litigate and potentially defeat a company, for example. It would be hard, but you could do it. Whereas in policy, just because you have good ideas or even a cordial relationship doesn't mean you can pass that bill, because there's all these different overlapping and push-pull tugging interests in many different kinds of ways in the legislature. So I saw us trying to defeat bad bills or put bills through. And I was like, we're not going to get anywhere with this because we have no leverage. Like, why would they do what we think is a good idea? What are we going to do? We can't sue them for not passing a law. You can definitely sue a state for passing a law if it's unconstitutional,
Right.
but that wasn't the arena we were talking about. We were talking about lessening mass incarceration. And so I really felt the lack, and I had this big question, like, how are we going to solve this? What do we need? You know, the first it was thinking about, well, we need culture change, which seemed like a revelation to me at the time, which is now almost sort of trite and obvious. Of course you need culture change. But then I was like, okay, policy is only a slice of the larger strategy. We need these other pieces to move and change in certain ways in order to pass these laws or change these practices. So I was like, what do we need? What are the pieces? We need culture change. What else do we need? And I was lucky enough, just as I had accepted the job that I'm at now that I described earlier, working for Open Philanthropy, directing their criminal justice, I went to this amazing training called Momentum, run by Carlos Saavedra and Paul Engler. Carlos now runs the End Institute. Paul is at the Center for Working Poor, and other folks that they had in as trainers. They're all sort of brilliant trainers, movement theorists, long sort of students of many, many social movements. And the main focus of that training was on the ways in which structure-based organizing and mass mobilization could work together. There had been all these tensions around flash in the pan, million people in the streets, but where are they tomorrow, the next day, versus day-to-day labor organizing, but doesn't feel as transformational. So they were putting on the map these like different approaches that people had struggled over, and put them in the context of a larger social movement ecology, which was really, really, really influential on me, around the relationship between the inside game, the outside game, how pressure is brought, and then how those things also are shaped by and relate to the alternative institutions that are created, and also personal transformation. And then if you can have all these different pieces working together, which you see happening in different ways, whether with the Indian independence movement, whether with the MST in Brazil, the South African independence, all these different types of movements have a social movement ecology with these different interplays with inside and outside. And so when I took that training, I was like, oh, we need to invest in the outside game in a real way. We need to invest in organizing.
But I want to, before we do this, I want to like set the stage a little better for people who don't understand what the issues at hand are. Like,
Yeah.
can we just like broaden, like wide angle a little more and tell me, and I'm a little bit tendentially a philosopher, so I want to go back to philosophical issues a little bit, but what are the ways that we deal with criminality? And can you just describe the difference between kind of punitive, retributive justice and restorative justice, and how people, how we have been, kind of brainwashed into thinking about things in one way, or, how the culture has brought us to one place in a way of thinking about this, and why it's important to look at alternatives to that? Or is that too big of a question? I mean,
it's a massive question. My simple answer is to get this book, We Do This Till We Free Us, by Miriam Kaba.
Okay.
Get the book. It's super accessible. She's a leading abolitionist, and the book is a compilation of articles and essays, so they're all just a couple pages long, really profound insights delivered in a very kind of digestible format. Mm-hmm. Not simplistic, but you can really take it in and reflect on it. It's not a huge book. Like, you really get this book. A lot of books in criminal justice or racial justice, hundreds of pages and all of this stuff, and it's kind of like a lot. So We Do This Till We Free Us, I think.
But can you tell us at least how you came to the conclusion that this is something you want to dedicate your life to trying to change? Like, what is it? What was your aha moment? Or what were the most important experiences or things that you saw as like just in dire need of addressing, that are worth like dedicating your life to trying to make this, again, from this kind of like position in life that you're in, that you could do anything? What is it about this issue that is like made you decide to that this is what you're going to do?
where my head goes when you say that, Tao, is that my philosophy is that we are all dust. Nothing means anything at all, like at all, really at all. The universe will eventually die. I mean, nothing survives. And it doesn't matter if it's billions of years in the future. Like, why would that amount of time of existence matter? So nothing means anything. And yet, or nothing is a consequence. In a sense, we're definitely all dust. In 100 years, we'll all be dead, for sure. But then why do anything at all? I find just this sort of existence of life to be meaningful, whether all living things, including humans, and their subjective experiences of conscious beings, and even the, suffering. Suffering is real and felt by even non-conscious beings, I suppose. Like a tree suffers when you cut it, and a person suffers when you harm them. And suffering is real, love is real, connection is real that people feel. And so if we're all dust and there's nothing really to sort of work towards in the billions of years of the future of the universe, why not just devote oneself to reducing suffering? Because that is a real thing. Mm-hmm. Even if we're in a hologram or we're all a program or whatever, people have subjective experiences of these positive and suffering and non-suffering. So that's my sort of like philosophical approach to how I like orient myself in life. I mean, one could also say nothing matters. I'm going to go make a ton of money and just have a nice time. But that, just isn't very appealing to me, in part because I can't take those people seriously. I couldn't work with them or do that kind of work. It would just seem a ridiculous way to spend one's time. I work very hard at what I do now. I mean, I work intensively, and I wouldn't work this intensively to just make a lot of money. It would just be boring to me. Yeah. Boring and just empty. Not possible. I'm not even saying I'm above it. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't get up in the morning to do that. Right. I just wouldn't. I just would refuse, lock myself in my room. So, but this work is very motivating. Because you have all these people suffering intensively, and it does not have to be that way. And in fact, we can do real things to lessen that suffering, and that's exciting. I mean, exciting is the wrong word, because it sounds like, ooh, excitement. I mean, that's very mobilizing.
Mobilizing is a great word for it. And what is the goal? So you're in charge of.
Hold on, but I realized I didn't really answer your question around retribution and restoration. I was going to try. So punitiveness doesn't heal, and it doesn't help. Punitiveness is a reaction. Whatever, you might stub your toe and then kick the rock. The bee stings you and you slap the bee. You're just angry, like, you hurt me. I'm upset about it. I have 2 kids. One of them is driving me nuts, and I might kind of lash out in a certain way. But particularly with children, one definitely learns that lashing out or punishing definitely doesn't improve the situation. It may discipline and contain a problem, but the problem will definitely fester and grow into trauma and resentment and come back to bite you. That is not to say that consequences are a problem. Yes, there are natural consequences to certain behaviors, but punishment is the infliction of suffering for the purpose of suffering. Whereas a consequence is to say, if you plagiarize, you lose your job as a journalist, for example. That's not to punish you. It's just because you're undermining the faith and trust in journalism. We just can't have you in this job. Right. But to go after someone and try to make them suffer and destroy them because they did something is a very empty and harmful exercise, in my own view, in terms of how I sort of move around in the world. And also we're in I'm saying this for the first time, we're in a multiplayer repeat game. There's not just one action. There's a lot actions that happen after each other. We learn from them, we see them. And we are all contributing to sort of the notion of what it is to be a person in this society. And when we punish and cause suffering for the purpose of it, we're teaching each other that that's a thing to do. So how do you then, and that it sort of propagates, we achieve our goals through causing suffering. And it creates these, I would argue, just very bad results, versus restorative work, which is around recognizing that we really need each other and we're part of each other. And even if one needs to take some distance as a consequence, we're not trying to inflict suffering on each other for the purpose of suffering, that we are trying to build community together, whether within one's family or, in the broader sense. And I think people have a hard time feeling that it is possible to create such community, and then they sort of fall back on retributive punishment as the only way to get things done. But I think I would say lots of scholars have showed, I'd say pretty persuasively, that it doesn't actually work.
And you made a really interesting point when we were talking last night about that there are parallels between a kind of extractive posture towards the environment, where we just kind of take resources from the world and in a way that's not sustainable, and punitive justice, and that the alternatives where we start to kind of cohabit with the world in a way that is sustainable and this more evolved view of justice actually go hand in hand in a way that I thought was really interesting. Can you spell that out again?
I mean, I think you said it pretty well.
No, because I didn't make the actual parallel. What are the different? What are the similarities?
The question is, so what we see in when people are sort of arguing for retribution, part of what they're arguing for is to say the value of the person harmed is measured by the amount of suffering inflicted on the person who caused the harm. And if you don't inflict very much suffering, you must not care very much about the person who was harmed. Now, it is gruesomely true that if you it's you're far more likely to get the death penalty as a black person killing a white person. That's the most highest percentage of death penalty cases would be a black person killing a white person, versus a black person killing a black person, less likely to get the death penalty, or a white person killing a black person. So in a way, it's true in a sense, we can see the value the society places on that life is expressed by this sort of intensity of this punitive suffering. The response that people will have to that sometimes is say, well, we need to treat everyone equally brutally.
Badly, yeah.
To show that we value the person who was harmed. Well, couldn't we value the person who was harmed in other ways that are more healing and supportive to them? Instead of spending $1 million prosecuting someone, could you give that to the family, for example? So we have to think about other ways of honoring the value of and recognizing the value of people who are harmed, instead of measuring it in units of suffering or in years of prison, which is so often the case. But part of what's buried in that is this zero-sum game, which is that I can't, if a person was harmed, then the offset of that has to be this other person's suffering, that this is sort of an on-off relationship between those two things, instead of a notion of larger human community and healing, where it's not that, when a harm happens, there must be a cause, and that cause must be punished in order to make things right in the world. Instead, to recognize that, as many smarter people than I have said, hurt people. When you look at someone who causes harm, I would dare say in every instance, look at where they're coming from. They have been seriously harmed. Doesn't make it okay at all, but it starts to make it feel kind of creepy and wrong to just lash them for it, because you can see how they themselves, someone who kills someone, turns out they were themselves the victim of a very serious assault, and no one helped them. And in turn, the person who assaulted them in that same instance, and so on. It's all of this kind of chain reaction of pain and trauma, which we miss when we're looking at sort of point episodic, instances of you did this, and so we have to have a response. And then the rest we kind of ignore. Instead, if we think about people as being connected and in relationship, we start to see how things all affect each other. So when we think about the environment, part of a challenge is that people treat resources like a sort of endless, free store. And then when you're done, you put them away and they're gone. Again, that kind of point focus of just we take and I don't really know where it came from and now it's gone. It's down the stream. Well, there's no gone. Like there's a huge garbage heap down the stream, actually. Throwing away doesn't work. It is in fact really harmful to everyone. And just so, if you throw someone away in prison for 30 years for something that pissed you off, that is creates a grievous suffering for them, and also deeply harms the whole ecosystem of the community. Does that?
Yeah, no, that helps a lot. And so, just to spell it out a little bit more clearly, you now are in charge of giving millions of dollars away every year with the intent of trying to make these structural changes. What in what way specifically? What you're trying to get different people elected. You're trying to support groups that are protesting. Can you explain just a little bit of how you use like wealthy philanthropists' money to affect what kind of change?
We have a strategy document on the website which you can look at.
What's the website?
Openphilanthropy.org, and you can click on criminal justice reform, and then there's a strategy page. First, there's a theory of the case, which is that mass incarceration is a political problem, not a technical one. Meaning that I could rewrite the code today to mostly eliminate incarceration. It's not like actually hard to do. You just X out a lot of things. Like it's human created stuff. So why can't we end mass incarceration? Because of the politics of it. You wouldn't be able to pass that law. And
is that because people on the ground would disagree, or because there's too many vested interests in the prison industrial complex and all of that stuff?
Well, it's both. This is why it's worth spending so many years working on this, because it's a pretty intricate and complicated problem. Because on the one hand, you have the reality of harm exists. People are doing things that are not good for them, for society. Stealing, assaulting, like these are real things that really happen, and there are survivors of these crimes that need to be taken care of, and we want less of them to happen in the future. We should all agree to that. We want less harm. How do we achieve less harm is the question that should be asked, which our system does not ask, because its structures and logic weren't developed to answer that question of how do we have less harm. They were developed in this sort of relevant period of time, which is this sort of whole apparatus and infrastructure of our criminal justice system, in the context of slavery, and class. And so as has been written about zillion times, the origins of modern policing lie in slave catcher patrols. The origin of modern prisons is, in the South after the Civil War, building prisons suddenly where they hadn't existed before. Prison as a place of suffering that people delight in is I'd say a Southern concept, different from, say, the Quaker version of a prison, which was about restoring one's spirit. Not that it was I don't think they did it right. I don't think putting someone alone in a cell is particularly restorative, but that was their intent. They were saying, you have the Spirit of God within you and you're going to be a good person, and we just need to give you some time to reflect. That's a totally different basis for putting someone in a cell than to say, you're going to suffer. Right. And then what? I don't know. You're going to come home. I mean, almost everyone comes home. Yeah. And they've been sitting in this traumatic situation, which in no way has been designed to reduce harm in the future. I'd say that there's no other legitimate purpose of a state-funded and controlled apparatus around harm than to reduce harm. Like, what other purpose could there be, in my view? So if acting retributively, for example, even if it satisfies some sort of felt need, if it actually ends up creating more harm, then it's illegitimate.
And where do you see this place for kind of like individual responsibility and agency? Like there does seem to be two kind of conflicting ways of seeing I'm wondering where the concept of individual responsibility fits into this worldview. Because I imagine, like, on one side, you could have a fully kind of almost mechanistic view of the way the large structures work, the way we are subject to, causes outside of us, which in a way I kind of identify with a more progressive worldview, because it also happens to be more in line with a scientific worldview where things have causes and eventually those causes are going to precede you, right? Whereas the view of like attributing like too much agency and responsibility, on one hand it's useful, on the other hand there's almost something religious about it, right? Because it also leaves room for calling certain people bad and certain people good. And I think there's a tendency, we have a natural tendency to go there, even though, because I think we're steeped in this kind of like religious, thought, even if we as individuals aren't religious, right? And I think we have to resist adopting in a kind of nefarious way this religious language of that kind of can dismiss people. But on the other hand, I do think we need to ascribe some sense of agency to people. Others, we're just gonna.
Yeah, but no one is. I'm not suggesting at all. Nothing I'm saying is about agency or lack of individual responsibility.
Well, I know you haven't said anything about it yet, but that's why I want to ask you about that.
The question
where
is,
does that fit in?
I'm speaking about how we hold someone responsible, how one is to be, quote, held accountable. Now, Miriam Kaba, who I mentioned before, and others have been leading an interesting conversation on Twitter and elsewhere.
We're recording. Okay, hi.
About the question of accountability versus punishment. So after the verdict, the Chauvin verdict, the police officer who killed George Floyd came down guilty. A lot of people said, this isn't justice, but at least it's accountability. Mm-hmm. And then Kaba and others are saying, this is not accountability, this is punishment. Accountability, one cannot be held accountable by some external force. One takes accountability. If I say I'm accountable to you, that is and I am taking agency, admitting that I am in relation to you, and then should matter to me how my actions affect you, which is not at all the position that he is taking. So he's being punished. These are all downstream of the question. We could say someone is, has individual agency and is responsible, and then what? What do we do about that? Does punishment and individual responsibility don't have to be intertwined and interwoven? Simply because we hold someone responsible doesn't mean we punish them. For example, if you said something that really hurt me for some reason, maybe even you kind of meant it at the time because you were like annoyed. I don't have to respond by trying to make you suffer. Mm-hmm. I could say, hey, that really hurt me, and I want you to notice that happened, and can we talk about it? And then you have a choice whether you want to take accountability or to say, no, I deny or leave the situation or whatever. And then I could choose whether, well, that failed. Do I now want to try and punish? Do I want to try and undermine you in some way or make you suffer because we weren't able to resolve this in some other way? So you see these different interplay of punishment is like a tactic that can come in that people can choose to deploy or not based on how other things are going. Is it the tactic of first resort, second or third, or do we have a value around trying to never deploy it, regardless of the circumstances?
And so do you believe that there's a society possible where we just stop having people put in prison?
Yes. Including
like the cops who, like the Derek Chauvins, you think that's not the right solution, is to throw them in prison?
No, I don't think it's the right solution. But in the context in which we have, it is far more fair than him not going to prison, because you have other people going to prison for killing people. Why shouldn't he go to prison for killing people? But I don't think anyone should go to prison. So I'm not delighted.
So let's take a case like that, though, where we all, where people like us agree that that's as bad as it gets, where you're using kind of structural, state power to just, subjugate and kill, execute people who have done nothing wrong. what in your kind of philosophical worldview of criminal justice would be the ideal way to handle somebody like that?
Well, in the world, you asked if it's possible to create a society without prisons, and I agree.
Yeah.
In that society without prisons, we don't have a police officer that can kill someone like that.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist.
Right.
But let's say in a different way, we're not in an abolitionist reality yet, and we're just talking now what should happen to him. The first question is, well, what would help the family? What do they want to see?
Yeah.
They are the most immediately harmed by what has happened. What does the community want to see? And there could be any number of things that they would find reparative by him and also the police department. And I couldn't venture to say because I don't know them and I'm not sure what they would say, but could be anything from, we want you to sort of devote your life first, go through this intensive reflection and introspection. And if we see you're coming to the point where you really admit that what you did was truly awful, then we want you to devote your life to persuading as many other police officers as possible to not do it that way. For example.
Yeah.
Can we feel how that actually is maybe more healing and better than him spending X years suffering in a prison and maybe being killed in prison because of who he is? If he has to spend the next 50 years going around and person by person trying to change other police officers or change departments so they don't do what he did, one can imagine a lot more good and healing coming from the latter, assuming again that would be restorative to the family. But that's just one example. Or take Harvey Weinstein, everyone's favorite example of, but what if, Harvey Weinstein, I believe is he quite sick or something? He's having a bad time inside. Some people are gleeful about this. But again, the people who he harmed are the ones you would want to check in with and see, what do you think? And there could be a process of people working together and saying what would feel restorative. But you could imagine, here's a guy with a lot of resources, a lot of connections. What if he was asked to devote most or all of his wealth, convert that into domestic violence shelters or something like that, and also to all the movies this is assuming a great deal of harm is committed, so we're going to do a lot of consequence. Every movie or any project that he touches in the future is going to have some quality, some message around, that pertains to what happens sort of against assault, or that in a way that lifts women's leadership, or they'll only back women-run projects. And you could come up with all kinds of things where the power that he used to harm people is then channeled in this different direction. That can only happen, although if he takes accountability and is a participant in this, not that it will only happen, but some of these things are only going to work with a real willing participant. And if you can't get that, then you could sort of enact other consequences.
So punishment, there is room for punishment, but just more as a last resort than a first resort in your
I don't think
views.
that punishment ever serves a purpose. Again, punishment is inflicting suffering for the point of inflicting suffering.
Right.
It's not, putting someone in a restricted space where they can't interact with other people could be punitive, or it could be a reasonable consequence, because every time they get around other people, they hurt them.
Right.
So you're not doing it because you want them to suffer. It's because you just need them to not be able to hurt other people. That's a very different motivation. And you would also treat the person in the latter case much more humanely, because you're not trying to make them suffer. They just can't be around other people.
Yeah. And are you optimistic enough that you think this type of change, in our lifetimes, that we might see a more humane approach to these issues?
Well,
are there examples in pockets of places in other countries and in small communities where?
Yeah, in Northern Europe in particular, there's almost no prisons, and the ones that they do have are incredibly, they're not places of suffering. People wear their own clothes, they make their own food, they have a lot of freedom to move around and interact, because the notion is, well, these people are going to come back into society. We want them to be functional instead of traumatized shells of themselves.
Yeah.
but also, you know, is it possible? Absolutely, I think so. I remember meeting a grandfather of the marriage equality movement a few years ago, who had the dream. It was Evan Wolfson. He had the dream of the possibility of, as it was then called, gay marriage. And when he first started talking about it, people thought he was totally crazy. No way is that possible, given how gay people are treated in our society.
Yeah.
You're insane. And he kept going with it and working in various different jobs. And 10 years later, they're like, you're still pretty crazy, man. And then 10 years later, they're like, what were you saying? Because things started to shift and people were like, oh my gosh, maybe it's possible. What were you saying? And then 10 years, I think it took 40 years from when he wrote his college thesis on it to when it happened.
Amazing.
And so he said, I think you can abolish prisons in 40 years. Which I was like, whoa, that's a lot to contemplate. That feels not at all possible. But I will take that from someone who achieved something that was kind of possible and made it seem totally inevitable. But when you think about the level of hatred and disgust and the way the church was levied towards gay people and how the church was all bound up in that, I mean, that was a monumental shift that has occurred. And now you're like, oh yeah, of course, gay people, like, obviously. Yeah. Not to say there's no more prejudice, and there's, of course, terrible laws being passed that are harming trans people. So we haven't, like, arrived. But my point is that there's a naturalness and obviousness now to a state of affairs that 40 years ago was, like, or now 50, like, totally impossible to imagine. So why not?
Wonderful. Well, Chloe, thank you for everything you do on behalf of humanity, and thank you for your years of friendship, and thanks for this conversation. We just scratched the surface of a million things, but like, I think it was good.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Good to be here.
Yay. That was fun. I hope it was as fun for you as it was for me. How long did we talk?
I don't know.